After shaping the material world and imprisoning the human being in forgetfulness, Yaldabaoth realizes that his work will remain incomplete as long as a possibility of remembrance still survives in Adam's descendants. For deep within the human being, there remains a presence that the Archons can neither produce nor fully master. An inner light, a thought coming from above, a principle of awakening that the Apocryphon of John designates by the name of Epinoia. The trace of a higher origin, the possibility for the human being to remember. Yaldabaoth then turns toward his creation, not toward Adam, but toward Eve. When he sees within her the luminous Epinoia of Life appear, he kindles the fire of sensual desire and understands that he must possess her. In his ignorance, he can neither grasp its mystery nor reach it at its source. So he seeks instead to divert it by corrupting the very place where it manifests itself, her body. His intention, then, is not merely to dominate the human being, but to corrupt him, to inscribe the lineage of Adam and Eve into desire, confusion, and the counterfeit spirit, so that human descendants may remain captive to the lower archontic order. The text then recounts that the chief of the Archons seduces Eve and begets in her two sons, Elohim and Yahweh. Then, in a further act of falsification, he gives them the names Cain and Abel in order to add to confusion, deception. But why did the demiurge seek to reach Eve in her descendants? And what does the birth of Cain and Abel reveal about his will to corrupt human generation itself? To understand the nature of Cain and Abel in Gnostic thought, we must first return to what Yaldabaoth is truly trying to reach by uniting himself with Eve. For his gesture is not that of a father in the human sense of the term. It is neither an ordinary act of transmission nor a legitimate fertility. It is an enterprise of corruption. Yaldabaoth perceives in Eve something that escapes him, a luminous presence, a power coming from above, which the Apocryphon of John calls the luminous Epinoia of Life. The term Epinoia, derived from the Greek epinoia, refers to the idea of thought, conception, or intention of the mind. But within the Gnostic framework, this intention is the luminous thought placed within the human being, the active trace of a higher origin, the silent remainder of forgotten light. When Yaldabaoth sees the Epinoia appear in Eve, he does not understand it. He senses its power, but he does not know its source. Faithful to his deficient nature, he, therefore, seeks not to contemplate, but to seize, not to understand, but to subdue. That is why he turns toward Eve in the hope of capturing, through union and desire, what he is incapable of reaching on the spiritual plane. It is in this context that two sons are born, first named Elohim and Yahweh, before Yaldabaoth gives them the names Abel and Cain, in order to deceive, as it is written in the Apocryphon of John. This detail is essential. It shows that their identity, from the very beginning, is placed under the sign of falsification. Here, the name does not express the truth of a being, but serves to conceal, to divert, and to produce confusion. Cain and Abel are therefore not merely two beings drawn from a sacred narrative. They are the products of a deceitful naming, of a blurred filiation, of a lineage that the demiurge attempts to reinscribe into his own logic. Their birth is not simply a genealogical episode. It marks the eruption within the human line of a corruption of descent itself. Ontologically, Cain and Abel must therefore not be understood as mere men. In the Gnostic texts, they already appear as powers derived from the archontic order, born from a will to corrupt future generations, then integrated into the structure of domination of the lower world. The Apocryphon of John indeed specifies that Yaldabaoth then sets them over principalities to rule over the tomb, that is to say, for the Gnostics, the molded and mortal body. They are therefore at once corrupted offspring and relays of the archontic order. Their reason for being thus becomes clearer. In engendering Cain and Abel, Yaldabaoth does not merely seek to produce offspring. He seeks to alter human transmission, to make life pass through the filter of desire, confusion, and mortality, so that the lineage issuing from Adam and Eve remains bound to the molded body, to forgetfulness, and to the world of death. This is precisely why the figure of Seth becomes decisive in the continuation of the narrative. Where Cain and Abel belong to the corrupted generation, Seth appears as another likeness, another lineage, another mode of transmission, attached not to the counterfeit spirit of the demiurge, but to the higher model of the aeons. In other words, Cain and Abel manifests the attempt to corrupt the human line. Seth represents its possible rectification. Thus, the ontological nature of Cain and Abel is inseparable from their mode of engenderment. They are not merely the sons of Eve in a reworked narrative. They are the products of an archontic attempt to divert Epinoia, to corrupt human generation, and to inscribe Adam's descendants into the order of death. To understand the place of Cain and Abel in Gnostic cosmology, we must first recall that they are not presented as simple human descendants. In the Apocryphon of John, after their engenderment, Yaldabaoth assigns each of them an elemental sphere. Yahweh, who will later be renamed Cain, is set over fire and wind, while Elohim, Abel, is set over water and earth. The text then adds that the two archons are placed over principalities in order to rule over the tomb. From that point on, Cain and Abel appear as powers integrated into the administration of the lower world. They do not merely live within the demiurgic cosmos, they participate in its governance. This detail is crucial. It means that Cain and Abel occupy a function situated at the intersection of two dimensions. On the one hand, they are linked to the elements of the material world, which connects them to the concrete architectures of the cosmos shaped by the Archons. On the other hand, they are associated with the tomb, that is to say, in the logic of the text, with the condition of the molded mortal body, chained to forgetfulness. Their cosmological position is therefore not merely vertical, as though they occupied a rank within a heavenly hierarchy. It is also functional. They participate in keeping the human being within the order of corporeality, mortality, and enclosure. Another Scythian text, the Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, confirms this reading while developing it differently. There, we find a series of 12 angels or powers sent to rule over their world, and the text specifies that these 12 are the ones who preside over chaos and Hades. In this list, Cain appears in the 6th place and Abel in the 7th. They are therefore not merely figures issuing from an episode of a corrupted generation, they are also inscribed within a broader cosmic geography, that of the powers who administer the lower regions, linked to chaos, Hades, and the imprisonment of souls within the demiurgic world. We must nevertheless remain cautious. Gnostic texts do not always provide a perfectly homogeneous cartography. However, Cain and Abel must not be read as two isolated figures, but as two powers belonging to a broader archontic architecture, for which the traditions propose several explanations. Even so, one strong line can still be drawn. In all these passages, Cain and Abel belong neither to the pleroma nor even to a neutral zone of the cosmos, but to the lower order governed by Yaldabaoth. Their cosmological position links them to the world of corrupted generation, to the elements, to principalities, to chaos, to Hades, and to the tomb. They are, therefore, not only the products of the corruption of the human line, they also become the relays of that corruption on the cosmic scale. Their place within the demiurgic universe reveals that the imprisonment of the human being is not merely psychological or moral. It is inscribed within a structure of domination that organizes the material world itself and is intended to keep the living within chaos, forgetfulness, and death. If Cain and Abel occupy such an important place in the Gnostic imagination, it is not only because they belong to a corrupted genealogy, nor even because they are integrated into the archontic order. It is because with them a new form of imprisonment is established. No longer merely the forgetting of origin, but the division of the human bond itself. In the Apocryphon of John, they are born from an attempt to corrupt the lineage. In the Hypostasis of the Archons, their story is immediately prolonged in the opposition of offerings, and then in the murderous act committed by Cain against Abel. In other words, their appearance immediately gives rise to a distorted, tense, torn relationship. From this perspective, Cain and Abel can be read as two poles of one and the same structure of division. On the psychic level, Cain and Abel allow us to think of an inner fracture. In the archontic world, the human being is not only removed from its source, he is also divided within himself. One part of him still seeks elevation, offering, the relation to something greater than himself. Another yields to jealousy, comparison, humiliation, and resentment. Their powers manifest itself whenever closeness no longer generates recognition, but competition. Whenever the similar becomes the rival. Whenever one's value seems to depend upon the effacement of the other. This psychic extension is not formulated as such by the texts, but it follows from their staging as powers of deception, division, and death. In the Apocryphon of John, their very naming serves to deceive, and their establishment over principalities tied to the body links them to an administration of the mortal world. ours. On the anthropological level, Cain and Abel may thus be understood as a narrative rendering of the way humanity enters into a logic of conflictual mediation. The other is no longer received as a fellow being, but as a rival, an uncomfortable witness, even a threat to one's own place. What the myth stages then is not merely an original murder. It is the establishment of a world in which proximity itself becomes dangerous. The fraternal bond, which could have manifested a kingship in the light, becomes instead the very space where rivalry, narcissistic wounding, and the desire to erase the other are expressed. In a Gnostic reading, this means that archontic corruption reaches all the way into the very structure of living together. Thus, symbolically and psychically, Cain and Abel do not represent merely two individuals. They manifest the way the corruption of generation becomes also the corruption of relationship. With them, the archontic order produces not only mortal bodies or souls plunged into forgetfulness, it produces a divided humanity, for which the brother may become the enemy, and proximity the very place of rupture. If Cain and Abel belong to the archontic order, their action is not limited to a place within the lower cosmology. Their power also manifests itself in reality, not necessarily as a visible or spectacular intervention, but as a structure of corruption of the bound. Their story in the Gnostic text stages a falsified generation, a degraded fraternal relationship, then the entry into rivalry, rejection, and murderous pursuit. Cain and Abel act each time the relation to the other is perverted by comparison, wounding, envy, or resentment. In the Hypostasis of the Archons, the episode of the offerings leads directly to Cain's murderous violence against Abel. In that logic, their power over reality as Archons appears as that of a division insinuating itself into the very heart of human relations. Their influence appears in fraternal rivalries, of course, but also in all mimetic oppositions in which the other becomes unbearable because he reflects our own lack back to us. It appears in conflicts where one prefers to destroy what precedes us, mirrors us, or silently judges us, rather than transform within ourselves what ought to be transformed. It appears again in human systems that organize permanent competition, a comparison of merits, the hierarchy of dignities, and ultimately turn the social bond itself into a field of separation. This reading is interpretive, but it remains coherent with the way the text associates Cain and Abel with chaos, Hades, and the tomb. More deeply still, their power over reality manifests itself in the fact that human life within the demiurgic world becomes a life transmitted under the sign of rupture. Corruption does not affect only the body or memory, it also touches the way one inhabits relation. The brother is no longer only the one who shares an origin, but the one whose existence may be experienced as an offense. In this sense, Cain and Abel do not represent merely a primordial episode. They reveal a dynamic still active within the lower world. Thus, the role of Cain and Abel in reality is not to govern external events like distant mythological figures. Their true power consists in prolonging within concrete human experience the corruption of generation willed by Yaldabaoth. Where Epinoia might have reminded the human being of his luminous origin, their logic instead reinstalls rivalry, confusion, and death. And perhaps that is their deepest function, to ensure that man, instead of recognizing in the other a companion in exile capable of awakening with him, sees him only a competitor, a judge, or an enemy. Let us now return to the question that has guided our reflection. Why did the demiurge seek to reach Eve through Epinoia? And what does the birth of Cain and Abel reveal about his will to corrupt human generation itself? In the Apocryphon of John, Yaldabaoth does not merely seek to govern a material world already fashioned. He seeks to extend his dominion into the transmission of life itself. Seeing in Eve the luminous Epinoia of life, he senses a power that escapes him, a trace of the higher light that he can neither understand nor produce. Unable to reach that origin, he then attempts to divert its manifestation by corrupting human generation. It is within that logic that he engenders two sons. Thus, Cain and Abel are not merely the primitive figures of a fraternal drama. They are the products of a deeper attempt at falsification, that of a human line the demiurge wishes to subject to desire, to the counterfeit spirit, to the mortal body, and to forgetfulness. They become the relays of a lower order that seeks to keep the human being within the condition of the molded body, in separation from the pleroma and in death. But their story also reveals something else. It shows that even within this corruption, all is not entirely lost. For after them come Seth, engendered according to another likeness, according to another logic, attached not to archontic counterfeit, but to the generation of the aeons. It is there that the true line of fracture appears, not merely between two brothers, but between two transmissions, two orientations of being, two possible destinies for humanity. On one side, corrupted generation reinscribed within the cycle of death. On the other, the possibility of rectification, remembrance, and a return to the origin.